MacDonald.
Yes.
All right.
Since we have Heather MacDonald here, we thought we would talk about things that she spends a lot of time thinking about and writing about. One is community policing, and Heather has studied the New York City police force in particular. It will be fun to learn about that. She's also done a lot of research into social programs in urban America and how they keep minorities, I believe this is right, how they keep minorities in permanent poverty. So, Heather, once again, thanks for being here, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Todd.
Talk to us about your reactions. Over the last year, we've seen a really volatile situation in urban America. We started off with the, out in the Midwest, the Missouri, God, the words leave your, Ferguson, Missouri. What was his name, the kid who got killed?
Mike Brown.
Michael Brown, right.
Michael Brown. And that was last August, and then there was Baltimore and other cities in between, and a couple of years ago there was Trayvon Martin down in Florida. What's your reaction as somebody who's spent a lot of time on this in terms of what is going on?
Well, I think it's a even more extreme example of the way this country deals with race and policing, which is to talk fanatically about police in order not to talk about the far more difficult problem of black crime. And so we're focusing obsessively on trying to ferret out examples of police racism, and you have a whole criminology profession trying desperately to do, fancy regression analyses to try and show that the police are racist in their patterns of deployment and police practices, in order not to talk about what is the overwhelming determinant of policing in this country, which is where crime is happening, and that is overwhelmingly in minority and especially black neighborhoods. So this whole Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has been a very tragic diversion from what really needs to happen, which is talking about how we can bring the black crime rate down. The fact of the matter is that the police could end all use of force tomorrow, whether it's justified or unjustified use of force, and it's overwhelmingly justified, and it would have almost no effect on the black death by homicide rate, which is about 6 times higher than the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. And the reason that rate is so high is because the black homicide rate at which blacks commit homicide is 8 times higher than the rate at which whites and Hispanics combined commit homicide. That's the problem. The police are not the problem, but this obsessive focus on policing is just really a diversion. And I would also say that the one government agency that is the most dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter is the police.
Yeah.
It's not their enemy.
Yeah. Heather, I have to say, one of the things that intrigues me about the things that you write are that you actually, look at the people who are most impacted by things like the what's called the broken windows policing policy, sort of the Rudy Giuliani school of policing. Not just that, but also the social programs. The things that you write. You've actually gone into town meetings and in communities and there are two communities. There's the community of the people who are actually in the ghettos or in the poor places who are getting impacted by this, and then there's their leaders, or sort of the liberal cognoscenti, who are somehow or another sculpting these policies, and they seem rather at odds. But you quote often people who are impacted by these policies. I'm curious if you have anything to say about that.
Well, certainly the whole attack on quality of life policing, known as broken windows policing, this is the idea that the police should pay attention to low-level public order offenses like urinating in public drinking, turnstile jumping, that is those types of disorder are important to communities. It's important to how people conceive of public spaces, and it's also an important crime-fighting tool because there's really a great chain of being in criminal offending. People who commit lower-level offenses are often engaged in higher-level offenses as well. But this whole idea of broken windows policing has been under attack over the last year as well.
Yeah, it's been knocked back. It's been knocked back by all of this, supposed racism. So my impression is it your impression that the New York City police are laying back? What's the truth of that? Are they not enforcing laws that they used to enforce?
Well, they are. The stop, question, and frisks are way down in New York, and officers across the country, I think, because of the very virulent protests against them, are not engaging proactively. Broken windows, yes, the misdemeanor, low-level quality of life arrests in New York are way down, and discretionary arrests are down across the country. But what I was moving towards is the fact that this type of policing that pays attention to public order, to answer your question, Mike, is demanded by the residents of poor communities.
Yeah.
They want the police to get the drug dealers off the corner. They want them to get the kids off their stoop who are hanging out there loitering and smoking weed. And so that sort of policing is, in fact, a moral imperative. And yet, yes, it is definitely under attack on the same grounds that all policing is, and that it allegedly, well, it does have a racially disproportionate impact, because it turns out that low-level public order offenses are also committed disproportionately in minority neighborhoods.
But I'm confused by this war on successful things. Where does this come from? Why is it that the left would go after something that has the positive effect for the communities it claims to love that you say it does? Is that a coordinated thing that's based on political gain? Do you have any sense of what the dynamic is?
Well, I don't think they're thinking along those terms. I think they just see the world so much in race terms. And, for sure there is a strong segment of the black community that supports the police. But there's also a strong segment that is never going to. And there's several reasons for that. There's the history of policing and racism in this country, which is real. And, the police were a bulwark of de jure and de facto segregation. And that memory dies hard. But what's overlooked all the time in the media is that there's also a significant segment of minority communities that are involved in crime. And their families are benefiting from that. And the police are obviously a disruptor of that. And the New York Times never bothers to check when they're going to get the man on the street interview in New York or in Baltimore, and they're told, oh yeah, I was roughed up by the police and he beat me up and whatnot. They always take as gospel truth whatever somebody on the street tells them. A police officer, however, is presumed to lie. The fact is that when a lot of people, a significant number of people complain about the cops, they're doing so because they're frustrated at getting arrested. So, I think to sort of say, oh, the left hates success, that's too broad. But what they are committed to is victimology and the belief that blacks are everywhere and always the victim of a white racist power structure.
But if that's true with regard to police, it seems to me there's a problem in that the police are organs of city government that are controlled by that city government and by unions that are controlled 100% by the Democratic Party. If the police are responsible for racist behavior towards minorities, is the protest on the street against those police not a protest against the Democrats? And if so, how come nobody puts those two things together?
Well, they will always say, of course, yeah. I mean, I guess what matters differs at any given moment. You know, the argument against the police is not that they're unionized, but it's that they're too white. And that, of course, is a preposterous argument, but this is what we heard. You mentioned at the start of the show, Mike, the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, that turned out, the story that was woven around that shooting turned out to be an utter hoax, utter lie, deliberate lie on the part of the bystanders. Michael Brown was not shot in cold blood by Officer Darren Wilson, but the theme that the New York Times and CNN and other media outlets developed was, well, the problem in Ferguson was that this was a racist white police force in a majority black town, and so the media will seize on that. Well, it turns out that race has nothing to do with how officers treat the civilians. And, you know, to sort of pick up on your point at the blind spots here, Todd, the Rikers Island jail complex in New York City is the second largest jail complex in the country after Los Angeles County. And the federal government has been investigating Rikers on the charge that it is engaged in a pattern of brutality against adolescent inmates. Well, I don't always believe the Justice Department when it's going after law enforcement, but let's just for the moment posit or stipulate that maybe there is a problem in Rikers Island Jail with violence, although it's certainly the inmates there don't help. Rikers Island is about 80% black correctional officers in a city that is 23% black. So the Rikers Island jail force is even more racially disproportionate than Ferguson's was. And yet, we are told that it is brutalizing black adolescent inmates. The Detroit police force is also easily, two-thirds black, and it too was coming under civil rights investigations by the Federal Justice Department. Same with New Orleans. So, the left is able to change the discourse. So it's not about a government union that is a problem. It's about a white agency that is preying on blacks.
Heather, I was rereading The Burden of Bad Ideas a little bit last night, and one thing that struck me is, when you're talking about, so this is slightly different. This is not so much the crime issue as the social welfare policies that this Byzantine, particularly I guess in New York City, this Byzantine array of policies that are there to shepherd people from earliest childhood to the grave, and that's another example of people being trapped. But I wonder, with regards to Todd's question about, who benefits from this, or why do liberals continue to do these things? There's a certain just simply bureaucratic growth to it, isn't there? That a lot of people just have a vested interest in there being a lot of poor people out there on the streets who need, aggression counseling or all the other things that they send people to your house to talk to you about. Is there kind of a bureaucratic? Do you think there's some sense of bureaucratic inertia issue here, so much as anybody kind of plotting evilly in their basement about how they're gonna screw Whitey?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of money to be made in the breakdown of the family and the breakdown of personal responsibility, and the whole social service profession is built on the idea that individuals cannot help themselves and that they are victims and need a whole array of case management and counselors, and it just goes on. And we see that, of course, in the universities with the proliferation of the diversity bureaucracy that is also founded on the preposterous conceit that college students are victims of racism and sexism. So there is a self-interest involved as far as jobs growth. But I guess my instinct is really to think that people are driven by ideology primarily, and it may coincide with their self-interest. But again, I just think there is a real deep commitment on the part of liberals or the left to the idea that America is divided between the oppressors and the oppressed, and that to hold people that the left has designated in the oppressed class as being able to help themselves, as being responsible for behavior. I mean, for me, the big lacuna in the left's view of the world is it refuses to acknowledge the role of behavior in outcomes. And I think that's the difference between conservatives and liberals, is that the left is always looking for structural explanations, and the conservatives are looking for individual choices, bad choices that have been made. And the left could say that the right is blind to the structural determinants of outcomes. But that's, I think, the big difference.
Topic number 2 today, Heather wrote an article recently on how California higher education is being forced to confront microaggression against women, minorities, whatever protected class you like. They're actually doing training in the schools to make sure everybody knows how to deal with this. And I also want to bring in a second part of this sort of tyrannical government that's being created with the New York Post story earlier in the week on how the Obama administration has created a database to keep track of the racial makeup of every neighborhood in the country. So first off, Heather, could you give us an outline of what it was that happened to you? You're out in California for the summer. Is that what brought this story to you?
Well, no, the University of California, Janet Napolitano, who used to run Department of Homeland Security, she had mandated that all of the faculty at the 10-campus University of California engage in anti-bias training. And I became aware of this just through reports on it. I was fortunately not personally involved. I'm not a faculty member at the University of California, but I certainly have been following the just fanatical diversity obsession on the part of the University of California administration. And this is just the latest example of a grotesque waste of taxpayer resources, but even more so, just utter delusion. I mean, it is very depressing. The idea that faculty members at the University of California or any American campus are discriminating against the most qualified faculty candidate for a position, whether it's in a physics department, an engineering department, or a literature department, because that candidate is female or a so-called underrepresented minority, which is blacks and Hispanics, i.e. not Asian, is ludicrous.
Yeah.
As both of you know, every faculty search, far from being an effort to discriminate against women and minorities, is a desperate, fear-driven effort to find remotely qualified females and underrepresented minorities to interview and ultimately hire. And yet, Janet Napolitano, the president of the University of California, like all of the diversity clones underneath her, are trying to put out the opposite idea that their own faculty, and of course they never name names, who are these bigots, who are these sexists, need to undergo diversity training and watch preposterous little skits about racist hiring committees in order to purge themselves of racism and sexism. This is absurd.
Well, my day job is, in fact, I'm a physicist, and I've been at Harvard for a number of years, and now I'm moved to MIT. And I have to say, reading what you wrote, it was obvious, that I've been not involved in searches for faculty searches, but for administrators, and it's absolutely the case that that people bend over backwards to get, a black female postdoc or anyone they possibly can.
Mike, how about Elizabeth Warren, who
right.
The purpose of her American Indian scam was to get herself a job at Harvard.
To check
Harvard
a box.
fell for it hook, line, and sinker because they wanted to file with the federal government very proudly that they had the first Native American or first woman of color in the law school, right?
Yeah, that's right. We had actually a secretary in our department when I was at the Center for Nanoscale Systems at Harvard, who our administrators were chortling over because she was not only partly black, she was partly Hispanic, and she had some Native American blood. And so they were talking to her that she's a threefer and that they can report to the administration, and she was a secretary, but the same thing in spades, no pun intended, occurs, at higher levels. But I want to ask, a question. You could argue, if you wanted to, that there is a preference for minorities. That this kind of preferred hiring goes on, and there's a justification for it. There was slavery for a long time, and blacks have not had, the opportunities that whites had, and there's some kind of structural impediments that they have or hurdles that they face. And so you recognize that and you say, we're going to, the whole affirmative action argument is not absurd prima facie, I think, but by saying that the reason people aren't being hired is not because they can't find the candidates, but because there's intrinsic racism, that kind of defeats the whole point of having to argue that there's a reason for, preferential policies. It's as though, Todd has said many times that liberals don't feel constrained to be consistent, but they're kind of arguing two things at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, though. I think you could argue that we need preferential policies because in the sort of Lyndon Johnson view of things, that you don't ask somebody to run a race, that has been held down in chains, so it's compensatory for the past, and then also argue that there is racism that also impedes the hiring. I don't see those as mutually exclusive, but I would say that a response to the first argument, which is that we're doing this compensatorily, and the presumption is always that racial preferences are to the advantage of the beneficiary. The most powerful response to that is something called mismatch theory that has been developed by a UCLA law professor, Richard Sander, and he's written a book with Stuart Taylor of National Journal, saying that in fact preferences harm their intended beneficiaries by putting them into academic environments for which they're not prepared. I would not want to be admitted to MIT because I would wash out immediately. There is no way I could keep up with my peers. That would not do me a favor.
Well, even if Mike is your professor?
Even if what?
Even if Mike is your professor?
I would hope he would absolutely fail me on the first day. But on the other hand, as a female, of course, at MIT in particular, which is under the thumb of Nancy Hopkins, and they are ruled by feminists now, I would probably have many more opportunities given to me to fail and keep going than a guy would. But the fact of the matter is that racial preferences are not a boon. They harm the beneficiaries, and of course they also then contribute to the view that many blacks have of, I'm in a racist environment, because they don't do well when they're put into a place where their peers have a 200-point advantage in SATs over them, and when they don't do well, the inclination is to blame the institution. Well, I must be the victim of racism, rather than to be honest about the fact that I was not admitted with the same qualifications, and asking for that honesty is perhaps unrealistic, because I think very few people are going to be that honest about themselves.
But Heather,
it's understandable.
if you were really going to improve the opportunities for minorities, wouldn't you insist that they be going to some great public schools when they're kids, so that when they get to a point when they're ready to apply to a college, they can actually qualify on their own and not need affirmative action?
Well, the left is going to say that we agree, and that's why we need more funding. The reason that
that's deliberately
unequal educational outcomes is because conservatives are too stingy and they're not funding public schools enough. Of course, that's not the case. We have examples of Newark schools with massive per capita funding, and then the famous desegregation example in Kansas City, when you had a school under the thumb of a federal judge that was spending millions and millions and millions and millions, and the outcomes were no better. I would say, for me, yes, good schools, but studying. I think what's really lacking is a culture of academic achievement, and it's I'm not one to beat up on public school teachers with the same alacrity as some conservatives. They are facing real challenges in these environments of kids who don't take their school books home, they don't do their homework. But
it seems to me that's the job of public schools, is to be able to get great results with the toughest kids. And it's the union. It's certainly not teachers who are the problem. It's unions that hold the schools hostage in terms of policies, and their Democratic partners who will not allow policy changes to take place that are based on the best interests of kids as opposed to the best interest of adults.
Yeah. I get that argument. I'm more interested in looking at the substance of what is taught, and one of my big bugaboos is progressive education. It was a disaster. The idea that schools should not be trying to cram as much knowledge as they can stuff into the empty noggins of their students, but instead we should have student-centered learning and lax discipline, let students create their own knowledge. That's all absurd. So, yeah, I know that there's union problems, but I think that you could probably have a teachers' union and have a successful school if it was committed to discipline and structure. And I like in particular the KIPP schools. That's an acronym, KIPP, that are very intensive.
These are wonderful schools, but those are privately run corporate schools that the left has declared war on.
Well, they're charters. They're not private.
Well, private in that they are operated by a company that runs the KIPP concept. So they get brought in as an overlay, as I understand. At least the KIPPs I visited work that way. Yeah,
you mentioned Newark, and Chris Christie is very famous and very outspoken about the disparity in how much is paid per child per year of education in New Jersey. When Newark being something in the, and I can't get exact numbers, but something in the $30,000 range, whereas the average over New Jersey's $12,000 or $13,000. And I've heard him speak saying the idea that throwing more money at education is the solution has been in the state of New Jersey disproven, and that is no longer a viable proposition. And
well, this is also to get back to your earlier point, Mike, about the self-interest or the occupational interest in dysfunction.
Right.
What you have in schools is just a massive paraprofessional, social service worker, huge amount of bureaucrats, but all of these little jobs that are based on gang counseling, teen pregnancy counseling. We have daycare centers in high schools for the children of teen mothers, which simply normalizes this utterly destructive behavior. So, yeah, that's what the money is going for. I'm not sure that teachers are massively overpaid, but there's just a whole huge bureaucracy that could be cut down if the school established very bright line rules regulating every aspect of behavior and no tolerance for misbehavior.
Yeah, but it's not about teachers being overpaid, I don't think. It's that you have to pay them all the same, so there's no hierarchy, and young teachers who are good can't work their way up a ladder where they actually get paid a lot for their quality.
Yeah, that's a problem. It's a problem. As I say, I would rather conservatives spent as much time observing the destruction that progressive education concepts wrought in the classroom.
Oh, I'm with you on that. I'm not disputing.
As they rightly do on talking about unions or vouchers and assuming that free market solutions will save everything. I think we also need to talk about the philosophy of education.
No, I think that's a great point. I just think if urban kids were actually learning the bad education standards that liberals are pushing, they'd be a lot better off. I don't even see them coming away having mastered those skills.
Well, I don't know if there's any standards at all. They're not promoting skills because it's all supposed to be self-learning. So
yeah, but you also talk about going to houses and there are women, single mothers who are 16 years old on crack, and there are kids who are sleeping on the floor, and there's nothing in the refrigerator, and it's amazing to think that the solution in some people's mind to that kind of behavior is we're going to send more people to talk to you. I mean, we're going to send people to your house to talk to you about that, and in one fashion or another, be it be it aggression counseling or something like that, or we're going to pay for something for you. We're going to go buy some new furniture for you, while somebody next door who's trying to get by on the same, in the same basic neighborhood, in the same basic situation, doesn't get anything.
Well, it's because of the blind spot to behavior. It really is. I mean, just in the liberal worldview, there is a universe of people whom we are not going to ascribe agency to or voluntary, that they are perpetual victims for which we need to administer them. But then, of course, there are the white racists for whom they are all agency. The entire world is seen as the product of their racial animus. Again, this is why, for me, I think that there's a blind spot in conservatives as well, in that they think that they can change everything with more policy wonkery and an emphasis on the free market aspect, and we just get the tax code right, or we do the vouchers and whatnot. But it also comes down to culture and personal behavior and personal responsibility. And I guess you could say there's regimes that are more and less conducive to personal responsibility. But not to talk about that, I think, is just as much sidestepping the issues as liberals.
I mean, if there's a solution to this, maybe it's the churches in the inner cities. Just like we've been looking for the moderate voices of Islam for the past 15 years, what we have to find, I think, are people like, there's a guy named Eugene Rivers here in Cambridge, who's a pastor at a black church, who's trying to work with those kind of behavior problems and that kind of self-destructive behavior, from within, but you can't find many of those people, and they are, by the self-appointed race demagogues are shouted down when they start talking about, the black inner city community's got to look at itself.
That's true. Religion per se is certainly no panacea, because the black church is relatively strong, but it often does look for outside explanations rather than inside. I'm not going to generalize. I'm not in a capacity to do so, but it would be good, whether within the church or in the political leadership or other community leaders, if more people stood up and said, every male has an indefeasible obligation to be a father to his child, that is, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest, the breakdown of the family, which is worse in the black community but is happening in Hispanic and white communities as well, is the greatest social catastrophe of our time. And if the family doesn't come back together again, you're going to get a whole lot more welfare dependence and drug addiction and utter dysfunction, because kids need their mothers and their fathers.
Time for our shower thoughts. Mike is going to talk about his